Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Thank you very much for clicking this recent video of mine. I've been away for a while, and long story short, I was under reconstruction, refurbishment, renovation, however you wish to label it. It's a process that I believe I had to go through. So I chose T.S. Eliot because I read a poem by him called The Love Song by Albert J. I forgot the character's last name. But basically it's a poem about T.S. Eliot's fictional character explaining the mental suffering he's going through. I believe it's more in relation to companionship and observing the skies, the buildings, and sort of early 20th century London. And there's a part in the poem that really struck me, was that he describes death at the foot of himself, and death is so close near his feet that even when the pallbearers are taking his coffin, in this case from the church to the burial ground, death is still lurking. And he portrays death as this particular being, this particular manifestation of, finally I got what I was yearning for, in this case a human being, maybe the soul, I suppose. But that's the thing about T.S. Eliot's poetry, it's very profound and there's many meanings to it. So this particular book is actually more on the essays side of things. It's one of my favorite books by him. It's called Essays, Ancient and Modern. Hopefully you can see that right there. I will do my best to add annotations and pictures of this particular book. So I'm going to start with the essay titled Religion and Literature. Quickly show it there. And there are some points I like to point out in this particular essay. Now, first and foremost, this particular essay was written in 1936, so this is just under 100 years from 2022. And he basically highlights the problems religion is having with the modern age we are living in, particularly liberalism, secularism, and the idea that God is in no demand necessarily, and the need for God is pretty much off the table, so to speak. And I really like this because it's very similar to the Islamic way of thinking, in terms of you see certain things happening. By certain things happening, I mean society deteriorating. For instance, you have the nuclear family, which is pretty much shattered in many parts of the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, and we see this trend moving towards the East and the Far East. We also see, for example, children not respecting their teachers, their parents. You could see them as a type of authority in respect to a child's life. Now, as an adult, you could see the police, the government, all these senior officials as authority who people don't respect. So, as far as my understanding stretches, in the Islamic thought, all of these issues start from home. So it's not like it, but it is a bottom-up scenario rather than a top-down scenario. So the fact that Boris Johnson did what he did in terms of the Partygate scandal, what Biden's doing with aiding Ukraine, whilst there's so many baby formula shortages in America, what Trudeau is doing with Canada and the authoritarian laws being passed, what you see in parts of Africa, for example, the French troops still stationed in Mali, or you see how the Zionist Israelis are constantly producing a new type of hell for Palestinians, you tend to realize that we are all responsible for these type of activities. So when I was reading this particular essay, that definitely struck me the most. So I'm going to stop talking because I believe Yeah, I believe that you don't really read a book reads you, because all the books you see behind me and all the digital books I have, and when I go out, try and do my best to find the best book, whether it's neuroscience, psychology, or everything else I tend to read. I make connections what I already have read in the past or in the recent past, as well as understanding something I could understand and move forward from there. So, in terms of T.S. Eliot, as I mentioned earlier, I read his poetry, was interested in who he was, and eventually found this book at Sunday Market about a year or so ago. And yeah, from there, just really moved forward. So, I'm just going to point out a few things. I'm not going to read the whole essay, obviously, although I do highly recommend everyone reads this if you're especially interested in contemporary thought and theology and philosophy, and definitely social psychology. But anyway, um, here's a portion I'd like to read on page 94. When the common code is detached from its theological background and is consequently more and more merely a matter of habit, it is exposed both to prejudice and to change. At such times, morals are open to being altered by literature, so that we find in practice that what is objectionable in literature is merely what the present generation is not used to. It's a commonplace that what shocks one generation is accepted quite calmly by the next. I think that's quite true. For example, the recent scam of BLM. I say it's a scam because the main individuals who started this particular organization, we now know, were funded by the same entities that funded the Hillary Clinton and Biden campaigns, a very democratic slash leftist campaign. Again, I might be wrong here. I'm speaking from as far as my understanding and knowledge stretches. Apart from that, many of them invested in properties, amassing millions and millions. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're fighting for a particular cause, in this case, Black Lives Matter, a racial cause that was seen as a movement of hope, really, by the African American and the I hate to use black, but the particular community that essentially came from Africa and the Caribbean and parts of Cuba, Haiti, parts of Latin and South America, etc. So it's quite sad to see the demise of BLM in that sense, and the proponents of BLM these days certainly either choose not to address them or they choose to just pretend it never happened. So that's one aspect I believe that could be applied here. Apart from that, when T.S. Eliot says it's a commonplace that what shocks one generation is accepted quite calmly by the next, is also true. He was born after World War II, so we're talking about our grandparents' age, so from the 30s, 40s and 50s, even those born in the 60s and 70s, usually girls were married between the ages of, well, it started from 15/16, I would say, as far as, again, what I know, what I've seen and how I've interacted with these various generations. So it started from 15, 16, all the way upwards to 2021. And the man was usually 10 years older or 15 years older or a few years older. Very rarely a man was younger than the woman or same age. So what we see now is that women are marrying far late, which results in lesser children, which results in a decline in population, which later in turns results in something catastrophic in terms of the preservation of culture, identity, and I will also include in the same frame of thought religion. Obviously, we believe that no one should be forced, by we I mean from the tradition I come from, no one should be forced against their will to get married, but this was very common, because I think, maybe this is just my guess, that people who were living during the British Empire had to take certain steps for the young women who were maturing and the young men who were obviously maturing to, again, sustain the culture, the values of religion, and obviously populate the village, the city, the town, and eventually the country. So maybe that's an element that people tend to forget. These days, those type of impositions aren't really in place. Rather, it's a position whereby I'm going to work for example, I'm not going to be a full-time mom, but I'm going to work and do my business, etc. And there's many stay-at-home dads, but as far as I'm concerned, I like the traditional sense of domesticality. Sorry, that's not the right word. Of a woman being domestic in terms of her understanding what trumps, actually not even trumps, but what transcends higher. So in this case, I will always be free Palestine. I will always be anti-imperialism. I will always be anti-colonialism. I will always be anti-LGBTQIA+. However, I will not demean or belittle another person who is a proponent of these types of activities and the organizations and all this other stuff, simply because that's a soul clearly who has been through a particular journey and has ended up in that position. So what was accepted before, what was detested before from a previous generation, for example, women marrying late, or men marrying late, or men not being men, for example, there's a decline in masculinity, obviously plastics in our blood, our diet, mentally, physically, spiritually, although I don't really like to use the word spiritually, I use the word religiously. I think that's a better term, a more concrete term actually. So we see a decline in that. So it's no surprise that, a man will act and he would, for example, lure in X amount of females or a female, and then once she's latched in, like how, I'm not sure if you've observed this, but anachronids, spiders, they have a web, and then a common housefly would be stuck there, and then a spider would just gradually, go towards that fly, end its life, and then feast on it. So that's exactly how I would see modern men from all cultures, all traditions, treating not only the women of their household, because many women unfortunately get disrespected by their own brothers, their own son, their own grandsons. So I'm not surprised that such a trend moves into the realm of marriage. So when a woman, as far as my knowledge stretches, when she says, I want to work, I want to do my business, I want to not basically be home all the time with a child or without a child, I believe one of the reasons is that detachment from this idea that a woman should be home and the so-called modern woman should be out and about. But we know these days that modernity is nothing but tragic. Again, a conversation for a different day. Moving forward, another part I liked, and this is T.S. Eliot's perspective on religious literature. I'm not concerned here with the religious literature, but with the application of our religion to the criticism of any literature that is happening or something bad is being propagated. By bad, I think it's important I define this. By bad, I mean something immoral, something reprehensible, like, for example, man and man, woman and woman marriage, abortion. Again, there's different conversations around that, but the whole idea is that if you got yourself in that position to have premarital sex, then abortion doesn't really make sense. Now, there are some schools of thought in the Sunni tradition, as far as my knowledge stretches, that an abortion could be done in a certain amount of weeks. Again, I'm not an expert in that area, therefore I'm not going to step into it. As far as my personal opinion goes, I think it's murder straight up. There is no ifs, buts and whys about it. We now also know that fetuses that are aborted, their organs are harvested pretty much all across the world. There's an actual black market for organ harvesting. Again, you can look this up yourself. But I agree with T.S. Eliot here. There's definitely this particular trend that is still prevalent today, and not just in the Islamic tradition. For example, many sects of Judaism justify Zionism and the illegal occupation of Palestine. Many Christians try and justify, for example, the Napoleonic Wars. They try and justify the Iraq and Afghanistan invasion in recent history, and it's a very long, brutal history. If we were to, for example, go from the English Reformation that occurred, which obviously caused Lutheran Christians and Catholic Christians to be different. Then obviously you had the Puritans, and Western Christians always viewed Eastern Christians as different. Like if you look at the Syrian Orthodox tradition, it's far more different than the Russian Orthodox, far more different than the Greek Orthodox, far more different than the Coptic Christians that are based in Egypt. So all this chaos is nothing but for political power. It's nothing to do with religion. First casualty of war is the truth, and I believe the truth in this case is religion. Anyway, this is very interesting. Writing in 1936. So the Bible has had a literary influence upon English literature, not because it has been considered as literature, but because it has been considered as a report of the Word of God. That's quite interesting, because many opponents of, for example, Islam quote verses or a verse out of context. The Quran, unlike a non-fiction book or a fiction book like a Dickens or a Tolstoy or a Dostoevsky type book, isn't necessarily from cover to cover. It's a situation whereby you have to connect various events and various theological, philosophical, anthropological, historical, psychological, and I will even argue cognitive aspects together. You can't just pick up a verse and say, okay, well, look, it's justified to do A, B, and C. Well, the justification for A, B, and C would be found in another chapter or in another verse, saying that for A and B and C to be a qualified action, you need to also include D, or you need to do a prerequisite of X, Y, and Z. So that's, as far as my knowledge stretches, how it's supposed to be. But now, you have the Old Testament, you have the New Testament, you have the Pentateuch of the Jewish, the 5 books, all corrupted, none of them match. But if you pick up a Quran from 500 years ago and the Quran from today, it's basically the same. If you were to destroy all the Qurans in the world, physical copies, digital copies, paperback, hardback, whatever, you can get a handful of individuals, men, women, and children from, let's say, North London, and they will come together and they will reproduce the Quran verse by verse, chapter by chapter, enunciation by enunciation. So this is one of the linguistic miracles of the Quran, and that's what really made me understand what I'm missing out on. I lived in Pakistan for about 7 years, grew up in London pretty much my whole life, and my conclusion up until the point of me taking my life more serious over the past few years, thus all this material behind me, is a product of being serious with myself. If I'm not serious with myself, how would I expect to be serious with a potential wife, or with someone's mum, or with someone's dad, or a customer, or a client, or the bus driver, or the train driver, or the person selling me the car I'm looking to buy, or whatever the case is, or the bookseller? So that's what I discovered through Islam, and that's one of the motivations behind the name of my podcast, Mind, Matter and Meaning. Moving forward, so I definitely agree with that for sure. These days, you don't necessarily need to take literature as books necessarily. This could be an article on Medium or LinkedIn. This could be an Instagram post, a Twitter thread, a Facebook post, or a Facebook group. I would argue those do now form modern literature. You'll be very shocked how convinced, influenced, and pretty much absorbed people get from posts online, from online posts. So moving forward here. Okay, here we go. T.S. Eliot. I'm convinced that we fail to realize how completely and yet how irrationally we separate our literary from our religious judgments. If there could be a complete separation, perhaps it might not matter. But the separation is not and never can be complete. I believe that. An example of this I could give is, I read somewhere, I don't remember who it was, I don't remember the book or the reference, I just went through it online when I was looking for a meaning of a word, and it was along the lines of, the atheist can disbelieve God but not the devil. And that's true because, for example, in some cultures, well, definitely in the culture I associate with, when a little kid or a child is, when a young child, I would say under the age of 9, under the age of 7, does something mischievous, right? Their parent or an uncle or an auntie or someone would say, "Oh, look at that little devil, shaitan. Oh, look at this little satanic work they're doing," right? Sounds a bit weird in English, but for those who understand Urdu know what I'm talking about. If someone said that to my child, I would flip a switch because the concept of Lucifer, devil, demons, Iblis, Satan, whatever label you wish to put, is so deep and it's something you cannot just listen and just sit back, right? It's something you have to address. So in this particular situation, that's the case. So I highly advise people to really understand the vocabulary you use. Like for example, I don't promote music on this page, but back in the days when I was really into the hip hop scene, there's a song by Lupe Fiasco called "Bad Bitch." I highly recommend that because he used entendres, which essentially says that a word can have more than one meaning. So double entendre, triple entendre, 3 separate meanings. So these days we know, like for example, usually young girls or women who are way past their 30s and 40s still like to think they're young, use the term "bad bitch." As a term of endearment, they would address their friends or someone else as a bad bitch. But if I was to use the same word, it would be offensive. Or if someone was to say that about them online, in a comment or in a post or whatever, that would be offensive. So where exactly is the consistency of thought here is what Lupe Fiasco was arguing. A great video as well. Anyway. Okay. T.S. Eliot again. And this actually reminded me of Dostoevsky's book Devils, which is about revolutionary fighters in Russia looking to overthrow the royal family and obviously establish their own manifesto, political manifesto. Again, I'm still reading that particular book. Very hard read, mind you. Anyway, when we read of human beings behaving in certain ways with the approval of the author who gives his benediction to this behavior by his attitude towards the result of the behavior arranged by himself, we can be influenced towards behaving in the same way. I think this is one of the most profound sentences in the whole essay because when I read that, it reminded me of all these online trends we see, like for example, Ice Bucket Challenge or whatever the new trend that comes to be. I mean, how many trends would one continuously be involved in? I understand influencers do it, they get paid lots of money, but at the same time, at some point, it surely strikes you in your mind and your heart and your nafs, in your soul, that what I'm doing is it contributing to the betterment of myself as well as the surrounding. Again, as I mentioned earlier, surrounding is your home. From there, if you're looking for a more political career, which, mind you, for all the people listening, I would say mostly females, if a man has ever lied or cheated to you, I highly suggest that you recommend they go into politics, because that's the sad state we are currently in. But I think, again, that's a result of the fact that men who cheat on their wife and women who cheat on their husbands is a result of this particular thinking over time that, a politician, if he or she does it, it's just dust under the rug, no problem, life goes on. Whereas if I was to do it, or any of the average person, you could have a net worth in billions, right? You are still seen as the other in the eyes of the so-called law, in the eyes of the so-called elite, in the eyes of the so-called deep state, right? So Here we go. T.S. Eliot. And I like this as well because this is something that's very relevant to basically ever since fact-checking became a thing online, which never existed pre-COVID-19. Again, I'm not going to go through the wardrobe of COVID-19 because it's that type of Narnia sensation, meaning that once you step in the whole COVID-19 arena, epidemiology arena, it's a different world. But what I would say is this definitely applies to that, as well as how certain media houses and many higher-ups control what we call censorship. So this is what T.S. Eliot says. With what is inaccurately called censorship in this country, he's talking about America, with what is much more difficult to cope with than an official censorship because it represents the opinions of individuals in an irresponsible democracy. I have very little sympathy, partly because it so often suppresses the wrong books and partly because